The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Mel Riddile. Okay. I will be your presenter and host for today's webinar. Our topic is Math and the New Standards. As you participate in this webinar, we invite you to expand the conversation on Twitter using hashtag NASSP webinar. You can also follow NASSP on Twitter. Our handle is @NASSP. We are also on Facebook at facebook.com/principals. During the webinar today, we invite your questions. Please submit them using the question box on your GoToWebinar panel. We will respond to as many questions as time permits at the end of the webinar. If we run out of time to answer all questions, we will respond by email following the broadcast. We are recording this webinar and it will be available on our website in the near future at www.nassp.org/webinar videos, and I'll show that address again at the end of the webinar. If you have technical problems during the broadcast, please contact Rich Peregrino at 703-860-7259. As you learned in last month's webinar, Literacy Lessons Learned, I've been involved in promoting adolescent literacy in grades 4 through 12 for the past decade and a half. For our high poverty school to succeed, we knew that our students had to be able to read, write, and discuss course content at high levels. Literacy was a school-wide effort, and we stuck with two goals, literacy and attendance, for a decade. We devoted additional resources in the form of a literacy coach, reading interventions, and ongoing professional development for our teachers. For us, literacy was a school-wide effort. Unless you've read our guest, Stu Singer, unless you've read his book, The Algebra Miracle, you'd not be aware of our long-term work to improve student math skills. Unlike literacy, math was not a school-wide focus, but Stu and I spent just as much time and effort and resources to improve math as I did working with our literacy coach to improve literacy skills. Although we did not have a math coach, our math department had more teachers than any other department, and you're going to learn why as we proceed through the webinar. Just as our literacy coach taught me what I needed to know about literacy, Stu Singer taught me what I needed to know about math instruction. His lessons have served me well as I have worked with principals to help improve schools around the country for the past 7 years. Stu is now retired, and he was a math teacher for over 40 years. His expertise in the classroom was only surpassed by his outstanding leadership of his math department and the entire staff at Stewart High School. Okay. Joining me today is Cecil Hammond. He's the math department chair at Muskegon High School in Muskegon, Michigan. Cecil read Stu's book last year, and soon after we began the arduous process of redesigning Muskegon's math program using the guiding principles described in Stu's book, The Algebra Miracle. But because each school has its own unique DNA, we based our approach on the needs of Muskegon students, not students in any other school. Much like Stu, Cecil's enthusiasm and dedication to teaching have inspired me. Today, we have Stu and I, as a principal and a math teacher, worked together for a decade, joined by Cecil, a math teacher who's finishing his first year at Muskegon, working with Principal Brad Perkins to redesign their math program. I always say context matters, and the context that we're involved with when it comes to math is that some headlines: why U.S. students are weak in math tasks, why math may be the secret to school success, elementary teachers' bias can discourage girls from math and science, teachers say math instruction needs improvement. Here's another headline: fractions are key to math success, new study shows. Another article: stop with the math memorization. It seems everybody's an expert in math. Another one: too much homework lowers math performance. And finally, someone even suggested that we stop teaching math altogether. It said, the headline said, if you want kids to learn math, stop teaching it. Now, another thing that we are in the context of the environment we're working in is widespread math anxiety. In fact, 50% of first and second graders feel moderate to severe math anxiety. But that doesn't go away. In fact, 25% of students attending a four-year college experience such severe math anxiety that it diminishes their performance. 80% of community college students experience that math anxiety. So we have a public that thinks we're not teaching math well. We have headlines where everybody thinks they know what math instruction should look like. And we have students with math anxiety. Next comes higher standards and higher expectations for an already problematic area in our school. But higher expectations, as you're going to find throughout this webinar, really means more responsibility for us as school leaders and for teachers in terms of making sure that students actually learn what we teach. It's not about covering material anymore. It's about mastery. Now, the new standards require students to demonstrate a deeper understanding of math concepts, which means teachers will have to change how they teach those concepts also. The new standards routinely call for students to solve problems that require a strong grasp of math concepts and to explain their reasoning, and that means in writing. So we have more writing in math classes. For most states that have adopted the Common Core or new state standards, the cognitive demand of the expectations has increased substantially. Now, Cecil's in Michigan. His math standards were most like of the states of the Common Core standards. Stu taught in Virginia. Their previous math standards were very much different from the new math standards. So those teachers in that state, in the state of Virginia, which is not a Common Core state, but which has had to upgrade and raise their standards, have significant challenges. One of the big shifts that we're making is the change from computing to problem solving, and we're going to talk more about that as we go through. In fact, there are 6 primary instructional shifts outlined in the new standards. One, the focus is fewer standards, but deeper treatment of those standards. A connection across grades, so there's a coherence throughout the grades. A demand or an emphasis on speed and accuracy. A demand for deep conceptual understanding of math concepts. An emphasis on application to real-world or semi-real-world situations, and the last, dual intensity, which combines fluency with understanding. So the approach to math instruction is going to have to change from working problems to applying concepts in real-world situations. So we're raising the rigor significantly on a population that we know we have to work harder with. So again, raising the rigor means increased conceptual understanding, increased emphasis on application, and a balance between skill and fluency. The Common Core expects students to deeply understand why math functions as it does and how to apply math to novel situations, particularly through modeling expectations. Now, just last week I was in Muskegon, and one of the teachers told his class something. I wrote it down immediately. He said, real learning is not working a problem that I have worked with you 25 times in class. Real learning is when you apply what you've learned to something you've never seen before. And I had to write that down, and which means the teachers at Muskegon, thanks to Cecil's leadership, really get it. Now, Stu, as I mentioned in the beginning, is the author of the Algebra Miracle. Stu, I want you to take a few minutes to talk about the book, why you wrote the book, and what you think some of the key points are, and we're going to go into more detail later in the webinar. So here's Stu Singer. Hold on a second. Okay, Stu?
Yes.
You ready?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, a couple of things. Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. A couple of things I'd like to say about the book, if I could just take about 5 minutes here. One thing is the title. My wife and I worked on this book together, and we disagreed a little bit on the title, The Algebra Miracle. She felt like it was indicating divine intervention, and when we looked it up in the dictionary, she was correct. The first definition was about divine intervention. But the second definition, I think, aptly described what we experienced at Stewart High School. It described a miracle as a highly improbable or extraordinary event or development or accomplishment that brings very welcome consequences. And I think that is a fair analysis of what happened to us. But let me give you a quick overview of what we had to do in order to make this work at its essence. Number one, we had to recognize that there was a problem in Algebra 1. When I began teaching in 1968, I had an interesting experience. Almost all of my algebra classes consisted of juniors and seniors. And it was explained to me that as a new teacher, and because the system there was that they didn't want kids who failed Algebra 1 to have the same teacher the next year, and there were no computers, they just simply scheduled every student who had failed Algebra 1 into my classes. That made it easier for them. But it also made for some very interesting experiences because these kids were so old. And they explained to me that in 1968, Algebra 1 was the course that was most failed at Stewart High School, most failed in our district, most failed in our state, and most failed in our country. Fast forward 30 years later to 1998, nothing had changed. Algebra 1 continues, as you said earlier in your introduction, to be a major problem in education. So we understood that. Now, the state of Virginia did allow for 2 years of Algebra 1, and they offered 2 credits toward graduation for Algebra 1. But the problem was our district was not utilizing that 2-year opportunity to maximize the kids' mastery of the subject. What we were doing was, in the 8th grade, some guidance counselor or math teacher in February was deciding that their students would either be going into Algebra 1 Part 1 or Algebra 1 in the 9th grade. Now, unfortunately, the result of that was that by segregating these weakest students into Algebra 1 Part 1, we were discovering that they were only mastering 30% of the algebra coursework instead of 50%. Part of this was due to the fact there were lower expectations for the Part 1 students. Part of this was because often we put our newest or poorest teachers in front of those students. But regardless, the problem was they didn't have a firm foundation. And then the second year, they were doomed to failure when they were reintroduced to a regular Algebra 1 class.
Okay, Stu, I'm going to stop you. For principals listening, Stu's making a good argument against a 2-year algebra program. So listen to what he talks about, because the rationale is absolutely correct, and I've experienced this again in another school myself. So go ahead, Stu.
Okay, so what we decided was we had these 2 years, but we needed to find a more effective way to utilize them. Even our best students in Algebra 1 Part 1, even the students that were making A's and B's, were failing the Algebra 1 course. And of course, the kids who were not making A's and B's had almost no chance whatsoever. So what we decided to do was eliminate Part 1 as an option at the beginning of the 9th grade. And instead, we enrolled all of our students in an Algebra 1 class. Now, what this did was a couple of things. First of all, it allowed us to place kids based on their classroom performance rather than on some subjective observation made in February or March of their 8th grade year. What we did was we put everyone into Algebra 1, and then at the end of the first semester, we took the kids that were making A's and B's and C's and just continued them on into Algebra 1. For the kids who were struggling, the kids making D's and F's, we would then put them into a separate course, which we then called Algebra 1 Part 1. We used a different textbook, but they learned the same first half of the algebra program that they had in the original Algebra 1 class. Now, the advantage to this is that they got to learn, first of all, Algebra 1 in a real Algebra 1 setting with the same rigor that all Algebra 1 students would have. Secondly, they were then given an opportunity to start over again in January and relearn that first half of Algebra 1 for a second time. And what we were finding is that when they went into their second year of math, they were now prepared to understand and master the first half of Algebra 1. In addition, instead of throwing them into an Algebra 1 class again, we set up a separate Algebra 1 Part 2 set of classes. And this enabled the teacher of that course to work with those kids, understand what they had been through the first year, and provide a better, fuller opportunity to understand the second half of Algebra 1. They spent less time reviewing the first half of the curriculum than you would normally in an Algebra 1 class, and thus were able to give 27 weeks of that second year to the second half of Algebra 1. And of course, this required, however, a lot of buy-in from the adults in the building. This is a wonderful program for the students. The students got to try Algebra 1. If they didn't do well, we had a safety net for them and so on. What it was, however, was a nightmare for the adults. For the teaching staff, it was brutal. They had to reconfigure their lesson plans. They often had to take on additional preparations starting in January. They had to start all over with new classes in January. But they realized that this was for the benefit of the kids. Likewise, the guidance counselors had a nightmare scenario in trying to create a master schedule. But again, the idea was that this was designed to help out the students, not the adults. And finally, the administrative team had to sell this concept to the community, to the other members of the staff, and to the district leaders who were not always happy with schools doing things differently from what the rest of the district did. And of course, then finally, what we had to do was we had to prove to ourselves that this was actually benefiting the kids. So we used a lot of data. We watched it over the years. We found quickly that our students were improving. Within several years, we had success rates of nearly 100% in Algebra 1. But the main thing we also had to learn from this was to put our emphasis on Algebra 1, implement it slowly, carefully, and make sure we were not advancing too quickly and suffering when we needed to wait through and be sure our data was accurate.
Okay, now I have a question. Cecil, do you have any questions?
I do. I've got a quick one here for you, Stu.
Sure.
We're kind of going through that same thing right now, where that whole idea of when do you kind of break the kids apart, and that's what it sounded like you were saying, give them a chance
Right.
in the regular curriculum. Was the only criteria you had if a student was in first semester algebra, like all students were, was the only criteria that if they scored under a C, then they would automatically be put in to Algebra 1 Part 1 and get to redo it? Or did you have other things attached to it, for example, attendance, behavior? Because we're starting to have that discussion a little bit. With those kids, they're going to be kind of expensive seats, if you think about it, to get in there. So what was your discussions regarding that?
Well, that's a great question because you're right. There's a lot of factors that go into kids performing poorly. We, however, stuck mostly to going with the grades. You're right, because the bottom line is that if attendance is a problem, it's going to be a problem whatever course they're in. We used to say that just doubling up the number of classes doesn't help if they miss twice as many of them.
Right.
So I understand that. But what we did was very complicated, but it actually worked. And that was at the end of the first semester, we took the A, B, and C students, which was going to be at least 50% of the kids, and just moved them through. What we did for the D and F students was we gave them what we called a translation grade or transition grade. And what that was is we developed a table, and it's in the books. I don't know which page it is. But what we said to these kids was, we're going to move you back to part 1. But instead of that D or that F that you have right now, if you have a D, you're going to get credit for having, an A the first 2 quarters of Algebra 1, Part 1. And if you had a 52 average, which was an F in Algebra 1, that's going to translate into a C average, let's say. I don't have the table in front of me, for the first 2 quarters of Part 1. Now, what this does is, as Cecil, you know as well as I do, the most disastrous thing you can have in a classroom is in March or February, a kid is sitting there knowing they're going to fail the course. They have no hope of passing. They're sitting there, and there's nothing but trouble that's going to be developing in that situation. What we did was we took that child, and in January, we put them into a classroom, and we said, right now you have a C average. And suddenly, they have something to protect. They're protecting that C average, and suddenly there is not a light, but a beacon at the end of that academic tunnel that's giving them an opportunity to succeed, where they would normally be viewing themselves as failing. It truly was a second chance. And I think what happened for a lot of the kids, when you talk about attendance, discipline, and so on, suddenly they were, a lot of kids like the comfort of failing, because the comfort of failing is, I can't screw up any worse than I already have. But you give them a C average or a B average, and now they have something to lose. And I think that we found that this particular process actually alleviated many of the concerns that you're discussing with attendance and discipline. Now, don't get me wrong. It doesn't cure everything. And if I ever told you that it cured everything, I would not be telling the truth. But it actually did sand off a lot of the rough edges on a lot of these kids. And by giving them the opportunity to succeed in math, going back to what Mel spoke about earlier with math anxiety and so on, nothing breeds anxiety more than failure, but nothing breeds confidence more than success.
Well, that clears it up for me a little bit, because I had a different interpretation of it when I read the book. What my interpretation was that at that end of that first semester, if a kid was getting a 52%, I understood the scale, how you would change it to a C and give them, but I thought you gave them credit right then with a C. But what I'm hearing now is that was their starting point for the second semester, and they still had to keep that grade. But at least with a little bit of, the way percentages work, I guess, they had a little bit more cushion too, that if they did mess up on the first quiz or whatever, it wouldn't completely ruin their grade because they had some in the bank there.
Exactly. That's it exactly. In other words, on their report card, and, again, talk about hard work for the guidance department. And I have to give our guidance director, you read the book, anything that made her sound heroic was an understatement. She was truly a hero. But the idea was, on their report card, it said first quarter C, second quarter C, and now they had a third, fourth, and final exam.
Got it.
They got the grade. Now, that does not ensure them of a passing grade. They still had to do their work.
Right.
But as you might imagine, suddenly they had a bankroll. We had bankrolled them a little bit, and they were willing, many of them bought into that.
Okay, so on our first go-through, Stu, correct me, we took half the kids that were failing, and they were resurrected to a C or above. Half the kids, not all the kids, did well, but half the kids ended up with a C or above. Is that correct?
Yeah, what happened was, first of all, let's just use the number 100 because it's nice and easy to work with. Let's say we had 100 Algebra 1 kids. We had a lot more than that, but we'll use 100 for example. If we had 100 kids in our Algebra 1 program, 50 of them were doing just fine. And their life was no different than it had been the year before. They just went on to the Algebra 1 in a year, went on to geometry and algebra 2. Of the remaining 50, they were placed into a Part 1 program with 2/4 of their grade based on what they had done the first semester. Now, they could still have Fs there if they performed so poorly, but the vast majority of them were getting, if they had a D average in Algebra 1, if they had a D plus, they had an A. If they had a D, they had a B plus. And then they went down from there. And the vast majority of them had some grades in the B to C category and some even a D. And of those kids, those 50 kids, at least 40 or more of them would actually end up with a passing grade in Part 1 by the end of the year. And not only did they end up with a passing grade in Part 1, they had studied the first 50% of the Algebra 1 curriculum twice.
Right.
And they had studied it at the same rigor, the same pace as a regular, legitimate Algebra 1 course would study it.
Okay, so real important there. We never compromise standards. What you did is vary time and methods.
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
So that's a key thing. In the old days, when we talked about tracking, the tracks were, one set of tracks was lower, ran parallel to the other set. And by definition, that they never met because they were parallel. And one set of expectations was lower. But here we're not compromising standards. We're saying some kids need more time and they need different methods to be able to succeed.
That's absolutely true. In fact, there's a subtle stigma that was being erased here. And that stigma was entering your first day as a ninth grader as an Algebra 1 Part 1 student versus entering the first day as all of these kids being Algebra 1 students. And I can assure you that some of those kids in that Algebra 1 class that got A, B, and C originally would have been placed in a Part 1 class. And Mel, to your point, they would have never gotten out of that situation.
Right.
They would have never lifted themselves up. And also, to your point, that's why the district math coordinator was finding that those Part 1 kids were only learning 30% of the material. The reason they were only learning 30% was because we had labeled them Part 1 kids. And, you know, they just weren't being expected to have the same rigor.
And when we talk about mindsets, labels limit learners. So whenever we put a label on somebody like that, it limits them. It creates an automatic ceiling for them. Now, one of the things, just to point out, and Cecil, jump in here when you have some questions, but the ninth grade was critical, and Algebra 1 was a critical part of the ninth grade. So the students that Stu's talking about, if they didn't successfully beat algebra, it was likely they weren't going to be successful in at least one other class. Now, if those kids didn't get at least 5 credits in their ninth grade year, they weren't counted as 10th graders the next year. So they were in effect retained, although in high school you don't really retain people. Of those kids, the data shows now, we didn't know that then, but the data shows that if a student does not progress from the 9th to 10th on the first try, they have less than a 15% chance of graduating. So the ninth grade is critical. We put all our resources, and Stu's talking about math as an example, whether it be literacy or math, we put a lot of resources in the ninth grade, and he talked about, I call it a foundation. That Algebra 1 is a foundation, and if you build a solid foundation, they're going to do better in successive math classes.
So, Stu, then if you could share this part and kind of clarify this for me. So when those kids came back then after they had done Algebra Part 1 during the second semester, they had still only done 50% of the Algebra 1 course.
Correct.
And so I was just reading something the other day that said something like a one-time intervention. You know, if you track those kids for 2 or 3 years, there's no effect on it after the 3 years. You know, it's got to be a long-term kind of intervention. So when those kids came back, let's say for their 10th grade year, what class would they be put into? What continued interventions did those kids see?
Okay, by the way, I think I read the same thing you did, and it doesn't make any sense to me, at least based on my own experiences. What we did was, again, the district plan was that you put these kids into Algebra 1 Part 1, then the next year you put them into a regular Algebra 1 class. And what we were finding is this is a little bit like putting somebody on a tricycle and then suddenly telling them to enter the expressway by going on the entrance ramp. And they were being clobbered because they were in there with these really smart kids. So what we did was we invented something that was not in the district handbook, and that was Algebra 1 Part 2. We took all of our Algebra 1 Part 1 kids and put them into 6 or 7 sections, however many was justified, of Algebra 1 Part 2. And what was the difference here, Cecil, is that this teacher, the teacher who stood in front of these kids, knew exactly what these kids had been through. These are kids who knew the first half of Algebra 1. They had learned it twice. We had tested them, and we knew they were successful. We put them into this Part 2. And what they did was, instead of spending 18 weeks, we had 36 weeks. Instead of spending the first half of the year studying Algebra 1, the first half, they spent 9 weeks, just 9 weeks, reviewing the first half of Algebra 1. In some cases, they actually got it down to like 6 or 7 weeks. And then, instead of spending just the last half of the year on the last half of Algebra 1, they were able to spend 27 to 30 weeks on the second half of Algebra 1. And I'll give you one example. You ask about how these interventions work. We would have kids transfer into our building from other schools, both in the district and throughout the country. And they would come into our building with an Algebra 1 Part 1 credit. And this is going to be hard to believe, but we tracked this, and we discovered that none of these kids, none of them, succeeded in Algebra 1 Part 2 in our building because they weren't prepared. They did not have the mastery of the first half that our kids did. We had several years where we had a 100% pass rate from our Algebra 1 Part 2 kids on our SOL exam. And that translated, and that's why I disagreed with the article that you read, that translated into these kids going on and successfully conquering geometry and Algebra 2.
Okay, so what you're saying is, Stu, if we build a solid foundation in Algebra 1, they do better in following classes.
Absolutely.
Okay, now the other thing is you changed the sequence for some kids. Some kids had one math sequence, other kids had another sequence. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the things, of course, that we were struggling with was that many of our kids were ELL kids. They were English second language speakers. And so for a lot of the kids, going from Algebra 1 to geometry was counterproductive. First of all, geometry tended to be a little bit more verbal. And secondly, it was different. And so what we decided was, with our kids who took Algebra 1 Part 1 and Part 2 in the 2 years, their third course would be Algebra 2. And mainly because it made more sense while the algebra was still fresh in their minds. And we found that we had a great deal of success by inverting that and then having them take geometry their senior year. So we had that. Now, for our successful students in the traditional area, they went from Algebra 1 to geometry to Algebra 2 to pre-calculus. But for these kids, partly because of language, partly because they were still fragile, we felt like going from Algebra 1 to Algebra 2 would make more sense, and it did. They were far more successful that way. And
okay, now this was a district of about 180,000 students, 25 high schools, maybe 26 high schools at the time. And one of the schools, who was in one of the western, more affluent suburbs, called me. One of the principals called me and said, "We've changed our math sequence to match yours." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, the whole school went Algebra 1, Algebra 2, geometry. And I said, "Well, we didn't do that." She said, "But I thought you did." I said, "No, some of our kids took Algebra 1, geometry, Algebra 2, and some took Algebra 1, Algebra 2, geometry." And she said, "But that's complicated." And I think this gets back to one of the points you made. This took a lot. This was not convenient for the adults. This was complicated, but the results, you're going to see the results in just a minute here when we show the results of the state exam. This is about doing what's best for students, not what's convenient for us. And this was very inconvenient. And I can tell you as a principal, I had to be in behind the scenes, leading the way in terms of lots of conversations with lots of people, like our guidance director, who had to be convinced that this was worth the effort. Of course, certainly after you started getting success, everybody jumped on board and no problems. But initially, we just had to hold the line and believe that what we were doing was the right thing.
If I could just interject one other thing.
Yeah.
One other thing that we did as a math department is we became very involved in the decision making of what courses these kids would enroll in the next year.
Okay, that's very important before you elaborate on that. In fact, all the departments, you were the leader on that. We called the math department our skunk works. In other words, you were like our test pilots. The math department made recommendations, correct me, Stu, to the guidance department about what their next math course would be, and we expected that would happen in all cases. Go ahead.
And well, not only did we expect it, we got confirmation of it. What we did was we had them print out all of the kids' course selections in May for the next year. And we actually got together as a department and went over every one of those kids. And by the way, to Mel's point, my wife was the head of the science department. The science department did exactly the same thing. We got into the workroom and we went over every one of these kids to make sure that they had been placed properly. And that goes to the point of, should they be in Algebra 2 or should they be in geometry? Things like that. Okay. And by having everybody in the room there, we had in many cases someone who had taught them Algebra 1 Part 1, someone who had taught them Algebra 1 Part 2, someone who had taught them Algebra 2, trying to decide whether or not they should go on to geometry, and vice versa. The kids who had been successful, we pushed them forward as well.
Okay, so
one last thought, real quick.
Go ahead.
I was going to say one last real quick thought. The other thing that our school had, and this was a reflection of the administrative team and the teachers, unlike tracking at a lot of schools, we had amazing fluidity in terms of the kids' movement. I had a young man come into a room from Korea, and he went from Algebra 1 Part 1 to Algebra 2. He went all the way up in 6 weeks. We kept moving him up and up and up. And eventually he ended up being one of our best calculus students. But because we were willing to move kids around, the guidance department had no hesitation, never flinched at moving kids up and down in order to best suit their needs.
Yeah, and the key thing is that from a principal's perspective, the teachers got involved in the scheduling, and as a result, we dropped. So it was harder on the guidance staff in one way, but this number of schedule changes that we had to make at the beginning of the year, like most schools have to make, was diminished significantly, and I think we cut it by at least 75 to 80%.
Absolutely. That is a fair statement.
Yeah. So, and when I went to another school down the road, we cut it in 1 year by 82%. And so, this is doing the hard thing is sometimes doing the right thing earlier. In other words, it's like the oil filter commercial. If you pay $5 now, you won't have to pay $500 later. And if you do the better job you do of scheduling in the spring, the less work you have in the fall and the more continuity you have in the fall. Cecil, do you have any questions on anything Stu's talked about so far?
Nope, I've got that. Right now I'm good.
Okay. Now, one of the things that you can hear Stu's talk, as a leader, we supersized his job. In other words, he became not only a leader in the math department, but I called him instructional coordinator. So he was kind of like the leader of the faculty. Stu, you and I made the agenda for what Brad calls it at Muskegon his SI team, or his school improvement team, or his leadership team, and then you kind of ran the meetings, and the teachers were involved in the decisions. And I know when I mentioned that to principals, they think that's a great idea, but we really made an effort to encourage teacher leadership. You want to say anything about that?
Well, I firmly believe that that was one of the best innovations we had, and that was that we developed what I like to refer to as a mid-management level. Our department chairs had remarkable access to the administrative team. We had remarkable input into every decision that was made in the building. Our department chair meetings, I'll call them department chair meetings, our department chair meetings could last 3-4 hours on a Tuesday afternoon. And the reason they lasted so long is because we had a lot of decisions to make. And the thing that was most interesting is at the 3-hour mark, everyone was still there. And the reason everyone was still there is no one wanted to miss the opportunity to have significant input in the decision-making that was going on in the building. This was absolutely bottom-up leadership as opposed to top-down. And I think the biggest change that made in our building was in morale. Teacher workrooms can be a very, very hostile area in terms of complaining, in terms of anger, and so on. But at our school, because the teachers understood that the department chair had this amazing access and the amazing ability to create change, instead of sitting around a table and complaining to each other, they talked to me, or they talked to the head of the social studies department, or I had people stop me in the hall and ask me questions. And what I could do is either say to them, well, here's why we're doing it, and they'd be satisfied, or I'd say, that's a great question. I'll bring it up at the next department chair meeting.
Or more likely, you'd come back. If it was critical, you'd come down to me and not tell me who said it, but you'd say, this is an issue we need to clarify before the department chair meeting.
That's true. That is true. But one of the things that we did with this department chair meeting is we'd have them once a month, and I would send out a week before the meeting to every department chair a questionnaire. What do you want to have on the agenda? And they would go to their departments and say, what do you want to have on the agenda? They would send that to me. I would create an agenda. I'd send it back out again. Anything else you wanted on there? And then finally we'd have the meeting. But here's the key. This was the key. We'd have these 3-hour meetings, 4-hour meetings, and one of our department chair took notes, and we would distribute the notes to the faculty. And I know it sounds crazy, but they would read these things because they felt like this was the democracy of their profession at work. And I'd have people come up to me and say, I'm so glad you all did this at the department chair meeting, or could you try to change that at the next department chair meeting? Or they would start, this is the best, they'd complain because 2 days after the meeting the notes hadn't come out yet. So I mean, I know people were reading them, and I think that made this amazing sense of my voice, no matter who I am, is being heard. And I think that mid-management level of raising these teacher leaders, whether they be the department chairs or the head of the geometry team, I think that was really important.
Great. Thanks, Stu.
Mel had started speaking, I think last time he was here, a little bit about that teacher leadership component, at least to me. And one thing that kind of piqued my interest is he had said, maybe Mel or Stu, you can speak to this, is that there was even a component where teachers, let's say in the math department, got to choose their own assignments, or there was a procedure for how assignments were handed out that included teacher input. Can either one of you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I know that what we did as a department chair was I created the assignments for my teachers. In other words,
And what did you base that on, Stu? They made requests to you, didn't they? They taught you. Yeah.
Yeah, the guidance director would come to me, and she would say, okay, you're going to have 72 sections. And of those 72 sections, you know, here's how many kids are signed up for Algebra 1, Algebra 2, geometry, et cetera, et cetera. I decided how many sections of Algebra 1 there would be. I decided, you know, and instead of having this cookie cutter thing where there were 22 kids in every class, I could decide to have 31 kids. If we had 62 kids signed up for pre-calculus, that's 2 sections. I'm not going to have 3 sections and have 20 kids in each class. That would allow me then to have smaller Algebra 1, larger pre-calculus classes. Then we would go to the teachers and ask them for what courses they would like to teach, what courses they would least like to teach, did they have a preference in planning period, et cetera, et cetera. Now, keep in mind that it would be a fool's journey to think that we could satisfy everyone, and they knew that. Yeah. But this also enabled me then as the department chair to go to Teacher X and say, look, I couldn't give you this, but here's why. And it's remarkable how many people will accept negative information if it's provided in a way that's honest and straightforward.
So what you did, Stu, the teachers made requests. You tried to match the teachers with the requests that you had, the number of sections. So the master schedule really started with the teacher and with the numbers of the department and build up from there. It wasn't something, for example, I went to the school I went to after Stewart. One person just got the numbers. The department chair never saw the numbers. And that one person in the school of almost 2,700 kids made all the assignments and put all the schedule together, and nobody ever saw it.
Absolutely. Early in my career, I found out what I was teaching in a envelope that was sent to my home in August, and that was my only touch of knowing what it was going to be.
So this is pretty much the norm, don't you?
Yeah.
Well, Cecil, that's what I was talking about last week with the school improvement team there. That it doesn't have to be that way, and part of the thing is we solved a lot of problems. Because we spread the leadership out throughout the faculty. No one person. This is a complex endeavor. We're trying to, I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a math teacher. I understood social studies. I understood English, but it was better. The decisions were better made at the level of it where the expertise was, and that was at Stu's level and the teacher level.
Absolutely.
So an important concept. So let me just describe the Stewart High School for you so you get an idea of what it was like, and then I'm going to ask Cecil to do the same for Muskegon, and then Stu's going to go into some of the data and the results. But Stewart was about 93% minority. 70% of the students were born outside the United States and spoke English as a second language. We had high student mobility, about 30% mobility or above, highest in the whole district. We had about, if you calculate today, probably we would be an all free reduced lunch school. So all the students in our school could receive free reduced lunch if we were if I were there today. So we had all types of risk factors in the school. So we and put on what most schools have. Many schools have lots of low-income kids and some mobility, but they don't have as many EL second language kids. So that adds another layer on. Cecil, could you talk a little bit about Muskegon?
Yeah, absolutely. We're around 70% African American, about 20% Caucasian. And then we have a small Hispanic population too. We don't have the issue so much with English second language learners, but we do have it's becoming more and more prevalent, definitely. The mobility that you mentioned there, about 30%, that sounds about right. I haven't seen any data on that lately. I guess the difference, we are 100% free and reduced lunch here.
Yeah.
The difference, I think, some of the uniqueness about Muskegon is the generational poverty that's dealt with, where it's 2, 3, 4 generations that that have been in a difficult situation, and that brings another layer of complexity to some of these issues also.
Yeah, and every school has its own DNA, and I know Brad told me something that really stuck with me. He said, we have many of our kids for 3 generations have not seen anybody get up and go to work in the morning.
Right.
And that's an issue that that some schools around the country are facing, and certainly puts a layer of difficulty on you.
Right, absolutely.
Stu, we made, as you've already talked about, data-driven decisions. Let's talk about some of the data here. Why don't you take over now?
Okay, well, we really liked to make sure that we were quantifying everything that we did, because I felt like you can't be subjective on this. You have to be objective. And the first year that we took the SOL exam, we had a 32% pass rate. Now, it's important to note that that 32% is not nearly as bad as it may sound. In a district of 25 schools, that ranked 20th out of 25. And since we had the lowest socioeconomic group, the coming 32% didn't seem to be that troubling. Likewise, the geometry and the Algebra 2 scores were also around the same position within the county. One of the things that I like to do with my data is not just look at the number. In fact, give you an example. In year 1, we went at 32%. Year 2 in Algebra 1, we went up to 48%. Now, at first blush, that would sound like we were really doing a good job. Then I discovered that when I compared it to the 25 schools in the district, we were now not 20th in the district, but 24th in the district. So we realized that we really needed to keep an eye on this, and quickly, as Mel has on his slide here, in year 7, we were up to 98%. And it's important to note that at 98%, that is way beyond what the other schools were doing. In fact, of the 25 schools in the district, at one point, I think it was a couple years after this, we ranked number 1 out of 25 schools in Algebra 1. In fact, during the decade that we're talking about here, at least one time we ranked number 1 in Algebra 1, one time or more we ranked number 1 in geometry, and once we ranked number 1 in Algebra 2 within the 25 school district. Now, when you have the lowest socioeconomic level, that tells you a lot. We were really, really overachieving, and going back to something that Cecil had asked earlier, I think that that success in geometry and Algebra 2 was a direct reflection on the superior mastery of Algebra 1 that all of our students had from this program.
Okay, let's look at the next. What's this chart refer to?
Okay, this is, I don't want to get into too many mathematical weeds here, but what I did was I created a chart basing success on the SOLs versus the socioeconomic level of a school. And as you can see on this slide, most of the schools hover around the line of best fit, except for the one that has the arrow on it. And that outlier is Jeff Stewart High School. Jeff Stewart High School had, again, scores that were way beyond what would be the expectation based upon the socioeconomic level of the school. And we ran this through, and we got our reliability as 0.734. Now that's R squared. So if you take the square root of that, which is what will give you the reliability, that's about an 85–86% reliability, which is pretty high in mathematics. Now, more importantly, on the next slide, we took Jeff Stewart out of that.
Because they're a statistical outlier.
Exactly. And if you take Jeff Stewart out and you measure SOL success versus socioeconomic, that is a stunningly accurate line of best fit. And if you look at the R squared on that, it's 0.92, which means that that's about a reliability of about 95–96%, which is almost up there with the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So what that says to you is that you could make a serious argument that SOL scores are as much based on socioeconomic development as they are on anything else except at Stewart High School.
Yeah.
And at Stewart High School, we were way outside that expectation.
Okay, so about 95 or 96% of the variation in test scores can be explained by poverty in that school district. And this is a trend that we see nationally, that we can predict test scores by zip code. But the message here today, folks, is it doesn't have to be that way. If we do the things the same way we've been doing them, we're going to get the same result. And what Stu's talking about is a staff that was willing to step up and do things differently and inconvenience themselves and take some risk to make sure students didn't fail. And as a result, students succeeded at a much higher rate than could be predicted. But there's this kind of relationship only exists in the real world in one area, in real life, and that is in education, and that is with students and test scores and poverty. And it doesn't have to be that way. All right, let's talk about some themes here that we've already talked about. One is this was student focused. We started with student data and drew from there. This isn't about what adults want. It's about what students need. And as Hattie said, he said the fundamental job of a teacher is to evaluate instruction and your effect, teacher's effect, on student learning. So we looked at what effect were we having on student learning. And that put an emphasis on mastery. In other words, if students weren't learning, we didn't blame them. We had to figure out what it was going to take to get them to learn. And because we built a solid foundation in Algebra 1, we were able to increase their math skills to a point where they did much better, very high percentage of the time, in Algebra 2 and geometry. The other thing is most schools, in most situations, time is a constant and methods are a variable. And success is a variable. In our school, success was the given and time was the variable. So that's what people had a really hard time understanding what we were doing. They thought we were cheating. In fact, they investigated us a la Jaime Escalante in Stand and Deliver. When you do too well, it's okay if your students, if those kids achieve at low levels as expected, but once you start doing better than their kids, they want you investigated for cheating. Stu, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I just think that the time issue was really important. I think that we recognize that by giving kids more time early in their high school career, getting a kid 2 years to master Algebra 1, then the junior and senior years, they were succeeding in their math, and they were then open to be able to take more electives and more other things. I always have said that success in math can be expensive in terms of time. It may take you 2 periods instead of 1, but too many times I see what was happening was we would put kids in Algebra 1, and then they fail, and then they take it again their sophomore year, and as Mel already pointed out, a lot of times they'd fail again just because the rate of success in repeating courses is not very high. And now you've wasted 2 years and you have nothing. But what we did was we took 2 years and made something of it. And at the end of those 2 years, they were now successful math students. And that fed into all of their other courses as well.
Okay, what you just addressed very well was the mindset. In other words, beneath all this is a belief that students could do this, and that if we could change our behavior, it could change student performance. And rather than blaming kids, we said if we have more work, harder effort, if they have more time, they're going to do better. So that whole growth mindset thing, the book hadn't been written when we were doing this, but underlying this, we had a staff that, as you've talked about, Stu, we put together a group of people that just believed in kids and were willing to go to great lengths to help them succeed.
Well, real quickly, those charts that you showed with all the data and the success and all this other stuff, that was presented to the faculty at a faculty meeting. And the thing that surprised me more than anything else during that presentation was that this was some pretty heavy-duty statistical analysis, and this was the entire faculty, including a lot of people who were not terribly interested in statistical analysis. And I cannot tell you how excited the people were to see that, because they knew it. This is something they knew. They knew that we were taking on a very challenging situation and succeeding. And that dot that you showed up there earlier of us way beyond expectations caused a ripple of excitement in that faculty. And Mel, I'm sure you remember that day. They were out of their minds about how they felt a real success, and they felt that this really was affirmation of what they saw going on, and that goes to your mindset.
And I think that was a day, Stu, that they became, in my mind, unstoppable, because people ask me what motivates teachers, and what really motivates people is to see that they're making an impact. And when those teachers saw that, they realized not only were they making an impact, they were making a huge impact. And, go ahead.
I was going to say, anytime I get a letter or a note from a student from 3 years before saying how much I meant to them, I was good for the next 2 years. That was like a 2-year shot. It really was. And I think for the faculty, they saw this as affirmation. And I can't tell you how many people were patting each other on the back, literally, when we walked out of that faculty meeting.
Okay. Let me do this. I want to skip down to some, because we're running low on time here. Anything you want to say about any of these things here? We talked about the scheduling, flexible scheduling. We talked about the course sequence. We talked about aligning the curriculum. Talk about feedback from initial tests. Anything you want to say about special needs students?
Well, the only thing real quickly about that was we were having a real problem with our kids with special needs. They were not doing well. And what we did we had a meeting with the department that was handling that, and we as math teachers took over those classes. Those classes for kids with special needs, we started having them be taught by math teachers, because what we discovered was they're taking the same Algebra 1 SOL as everybody else, but they were having teachers who were more well-versed in their special needs than they were in the actual curriculum. And while that was important, what we tried to do was give them the math that they needed, and we saw their scores go up remarkably after that happened.
Team taught then, would you say?
Yeah, what we did was, we actually team taught them. They helped us with whatever the disability might be that these kids had, but we actually had a math teacher in front of those kids, and that was huge, because I remember one year we had a 0 for 33 with our special needs kids. Of the 33 kids who took the Algebra 1 SOL, none passed. And that's when that was a wake-up call, because unfortunately before that we had kind of segregated in our building the special needs kids from everybody else. I wasn't aware that this was going on, and then we met with the teachers, and these guys were very concerned about their kids as well, and more than open to finding a solution. And the solution was that we started to team teach, basically, but what we did was we got the math teachers teaching the math to these kids, and then eventually we actually went out and got a teacher who was certified in Algebra 1 to teach these kids, and also certified in special ed. So we recognized this was a problem that would not be solved by just keeping the status quo.
Okay. All right. Talk about building your team, Stu.
Well, one of the biggest things that we had at our school was that the department chairs really were the people who hired the teachers. And that made a huge difference, because it allowed us to, number one, really explain to them, the candidates, the applicants, what to expect from us, and it also gave us a chance to really observe them. And we turned the hiring process into, well, I got to say that most department chairs by the end of the year would say to you, the most important thing I do is hire new teachers. And I agree with that, because that's what we have to build our program on.
Would you say the administrators abdicated responsibility, or what was their role?
Well, they were involved in it. It would usually be an administrator and a department chair doing the interviewing. And no one was hired without a 2-0 vote. In other words, both the administrator and the teacher had the veto power. And I think that was really important. Real quick story, we had one interview, really liked the guy, but he didn't want to teach at our school because his daughter went to a different school. He lived right next door to this different school. He wanted to teach at this different school. He went over there to be interviewed. They couldn't find anybody to interview him. He's a math teacher, so they had an English teacher interview him. And he came back to me and says, I want to work where they take hiring seriously. And I think that's what we did. We took it very seriously.
Okay, and sometimes you brought people back for a second visit. Is that correct?
Right. We would like to bring them back for a second visit. We usually like to have them eat lunch in the math workroom with the teachers and see how I would actually see how they would interact with each other, and also give them a chance to meet who would very well might be their future colleagues.
Any questions on that, Cecil?
No, we had talked about that a little bit, and we definitely don't. We're a part of the hiring process, but not to that extent at all, at least from what it sounds like. So maybe that's something we would do in the future.
Well, and the result of that, here's what the result is. When the teacher comes to work there, the teachers in their department are vested in their success. They do anything they can to help them be successful because they were part of the decision. And of course, that permeates everything. If people are involved in the decision, they buy into it. So accountability, if you're going to hold people accountable, you're going to have to involve them in decisions. And I've learned that over a number of years, and you don't get the kind of buy-in. And what Stu's talking about is not buy-in, ownership, shared ownership, by keeping people at arm's length out of these decisions. It's critical. Stu, we're going to talk about implementation. Anything you want to say about data or barriers that we had to remove? You've talked a lot about that, but anything else you want to add there?
Well, I just think that one thing that we always kept emphasizing was innovate slowly and carefully. Always keep an eye on the data. Don't ever just make change for the sake of change. And one other thing, don't be afraid to say that you've made a mistake. There were a couple of innovations that we tried. We looked at them after they had a year or two, and we decided, hey, these aren't working. And there's no need to have things just for the sake of change. So we really kept an eye on the data both in a positive and in a negative way. And in terms of barriers, I think you just have to get away from the mindset that, everything fits everybody. You have to keep looking at what you need to do in order to make a program that can be successful for everyone.
Okay, good point. All right, what Stu's talking about is lessons learned. We learned from experience, but we didn't. If it didn't work, we just stopped doing it. So anything you want to say on any of these 5 key points from lessons learned about any of these things? You talked about the semester algebra. What's the testing report card? What do you mean by that?
Well, what I did was I created a spreadsheet of data based on how we had done the year before, how we were doing this year, how we were comparing to other schools, and so on. And we actually turned this into something that we handed out to the parents at back to school night. And one of the reasons that I thought this was very important was this was a sheet of paper that made every room on back to school night have the same talking points. And that is, we knew what we had done well, what we needed to improve on, what we were improving on, and it gave a cohesive nature to our department. Internal assessments, we were monitoring our success of our kids on a regular basis every 9 weeks. And what we did was we believed in the concept of leaving your ego at the front door. And what we use these assessments as a means for us to judge how all of us were doing. There were no judgments passed. What we were doing was we were giving teachers and students, but mostly in this case teachers, the opportunity to see how well the students were doing and also to see how well they were doing. And once they got past the point of worrying that there was some sort of negativity attached to it, they started to embrace the idea of, well, I need to improve on this, or I'm doing really well on that. And this was especially effective for newer teachers. They were often stunned at how well they were doing. And they had no idea because they were in a vacuum until we started having these internal assessments. Another thing that we did was that we asked the teachers to predict how many of their kids would pass, how many of their kids would not pass the SOLs. Now, we didn't ask them to do it individually, say Johnny's not going to pass, Billy is. But what this did was it made them stop for a moment and try to envision, what does a successful student look like? What does a student at risk look like? And then what that would enable them to do in the future is to look at their kids the next year and be able to recognize much more readily those kids who were at risk, and they could intervene even faster. And a lot of the teachers really felt like this was a help to make them focus on what was, indicators of success, what were indicators of failure. And I've already talked about the special.
Yeah. So here's what we learned from International Baccalaureate was through those internal assessments, we started to be able to predict as time went on, scores better and better. And as a result, what we did, we started tutoring kids and doing after-school tutoring earlier in the school year. We figured out March was too late. In other words, we had the test in May. We started much earlier in the school year.
Oh yeah, our first internal assessment was at the end of October.
Yeah. So if you're waiting till the spring to start reviewing things with your kids, it's not going to happen.
And we could discover things right there at the end of October. One teacher might not, his or her students may not be doing as well, and we could fix it, and we did. And I mean, the teachers learned that this was just great because it made their lives better too. I mean, there's nothing better for a teacher than to have all their kids succeed, and nothing worse than, as I said before, sit in March with half your kids on a path to failure.
Right. Cecil, any questions there?
No, I've got that. It just sounds like from what we've been saying about the intervention you put in is probably pretty close to like flipping kind of the normal philosophy. I know I don't know if this is just Michigan or not, but a lot of schools have 2-year algebra, but it's algebra 2. Where those kids that get to algebra 2 are having difficulty, so you can spread it out over 2 years. And if you walk into a calculus class, like you said, if there's 62, you'd make 2 calculus classes of it. Well, if you walk into a calculus class, you're probably guaranteed to see smaller class sizes there. And then the exact opposite, would be algebra. There's not necessarily an algebra 1 over 2 years, like there probably should be.
Yes.
And if you walk into an algebra class, you're probably going to see 31 kids in it. Instead of, a little bit smaller.
That's a very good point. In other words, what most schools do is they have their best students in the smallest classes with the most experienced teachers. What Stu's talking about is he had the most experienced teachers in the smallest classes with the neediest students. That's a total reversal, like you say, flipping the philosophy. I like that term, flipping the philosophy. All right, let's go ahead, Stu.
I was just going to say, it's just common sense. I mean, if you're going to build a building, what do you want to have sturdier, the foundation or the third floor? And I think that in math, which is a skill-based endeavor, like English and foreign language and music, in math, you want to have that foundation, Algebra 1, to be rock solid. And worrying about that at Algebra 2 is a little bit late.
Well, we use a medical model. In other words, the most needy patients are in intensive care with the best doctors, as opposed to the opposite. So it's kind of more of a medical idea. Let's review some really important ideas here that we've covered. One is you got to have a really clear focus on what you want to accomplish. Stu talked about Algebra 1 being that focus. We learned through experience that if we get those kids that were really solid algebra, they were better math students all the way around. The staff has to have the mindset that these kids can do the work, that it's just going to take more time and more effort. And that really it's not about covering material, it's about mastery. So you have two choices. You can cover less material or you can increase the time. And so what we had to do is increase the time because we couldn't sacrifice standards. We talked about that. It's about collaboration. It's about teachers working together with teachers, team members, teachers working with administrators and school leaders to get things done, and a partnership, not as equal partners. I'll go back to the medical model. The hospitals have a hospital administrator and they have a chief of staff. And I was like the hospital administrator, and Stu really functioned as the chief of the medical staff, in this case, the teaching staff. Nothing was about the ABCs. And when I talk about ABCs, I mean administration by convenience. Most of the things we have to do in schools are the hardest things to do, or we'd already be doing them. So if you find easy ways to do things, they're probably not going to work. This is a long-term initiative. We showed the graph at year 1 to year 7. This is a long-term process, but once you start that process, it really runs. The other thing, we looked at quick wins. Some things we found really right away we had successes, and we pointed to those, and Stu talked a little bit about those. And the key thing, it's not about individuals, it's about team. It's about what we do together, not what you want, but what our students need, and about building that team. And it's really about what I found is that successful schools and school districts consistently keep the main thing, day after day, year after year. They stay with the course. Schools that are floundering change from one thing to another year after year until they have 12 to 18 different things they're doing, none of which they're doing very well. And as Jim Collins said, no matter what your circumstances, that doesn't define the success of your school. It's going to be a matter of your will to carry it out. And that's the will of the staff, the will of the school leader. Now, we had a few questions, and I saw Kevin ask some questions, but I think Stu already answered those. Kevin, if we haven't answered those questions, come back to us. We'll get back to you by email. I'd like to extend an invitation to join your colleagues in Orlando on February 25th to 27th, 2016 for NASSP's annual conference, Ignite 16. You can learn about the conference and register at the address shown on this slide. And this webinar recording will be accessible within the next probably 48 hours at the address, and I'll leave that there for just a second. Stu and Cecil, thank you very much. I learned a lot as usual. Thank you for being part of our program today.
Thank you, and good luck, Cecil. I hope that everything goes well for you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And if anybody gets a chance to read the book that Stu and Mel is a part of, it is, believe it or not, it's actually kind of a page turner. It's a very, very good book. So I really appreciate that you put that together and everything.
Well, thank you.
That was a great read.
Okay, Cecil, thank you, and good luck at graduation.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
Bye, guys.